there is a moment most people never talk about, and it did not happen on a soundstage or during a press tour or in a writer's room full of people pitching ideas. It happened on a quiet piece of land in Simi Valley, California, where a group of people who had spent nearly a decade pretending to be a family stood together without a single word between them, watching their world burn to the ground. Nobody called cut. Nobody reached for a fire extinguisher. The man who built that world had ordered every stick of it destroyed, and the cast of Little House on the Prairie stood there with real tears on their faces while the dynamite did exactly what Michael Landon had wired it to do. What you are about to hear is not the story you grew up watching on your television screen. Underneath the warmth, underneath the bonnets and the wagon paths and the glowing fireplace scenes, there was another story entirely, one that was never written into the scripts, never approved by NBC, and never meant to reach the ears of the millions of families who sat down every week believing Walnut Grove was the safest place on earth. The truth is more complicated, more human, and in certain ways more powerful than anything that ever aired on that beloved show. And it begins the way most buried stories begin, with a man who needed complete control over everything he touched. Little House on the Prairie arrived on American screens in September of 1974, and almost immediately it stopped feeling like a television program. Families did not schedule it the way they scheduled entertainment. They scheduled it the way you schedule something that genuinely matters to you, the way you make time for a phone call with someone you love. The show followed the Ingalls family living on the open frontier, scraping by on very little and holding everything together through faith and stubbornness and the kind of love that does not require money to survive. Charles Ingalls, brought to life by Michael Landon, was the father figure that audiences in the 1970s were quietly desperate for, calm and strong and always home before dark. Caroline, Mary, Laura, and the rotating cast of neighbors who filled out Walnut Grove became as familiar to viewers as people they actually knew. And for 9 seasons and more than 200 episodes, that world delivered something most television simply cannot offer. It made people feel genuinely safe. But safety, as it turned out, was the show's greatest and most carefully maintained illusion. Behind every tender scene between father and daughter, behind every episode that closed with a lesson learned and a warm embrace, a completely different story was unfolding on the other side of the camera. A story of fierce control, festering rivalry, hidden grief, a landscape contaminated by a nuclear accident nobody talked about, and a pressure that would have fractured most people long before the 9 years were up. The world the audience loved was emotionally honest in many ways. The machinery producing it was anything but peaceful, and the man running that machinery was Michael Landon, who by most accounts did not simply make this show, but consumed it entirely. Landon was not an actor who showed up, hit his marks, and went home. He wrote the scripts, directed the episodes, produced the series, and starred in nearly every frame of it, which meant that almost every creative decision, every story choice, every scene that reached the broadcast cut passed through one set of hands. That level of control produced something genuinely extraordinary, and it also produced an environment that was, by multiple accounts, exhausting in ways that never made it into any interview. People who worked beside him describe a man operating at an intensity most could not match, arriving before anyone else, staying after everyone had left, and expecting the pace to hold without complaint or negotiation. On the hot California filming days out at Big Sky Ranch in Simi Valley, Landon was a constant physical presence, nearly always carrying his famous blue ceramic mug. Audiences assumed coffee. The people who spent their days working beside him knew better, because that mug frequently held something considerably stronger, and it was one of several open secrets kept quiet by people who understood the unspoken rule of working under Michael Landon's roof. You did not question the man. You kept your head down, matched his pace, and stayed on the right side of him, because falling to the wrong side carried a very real and lasting cost. Karen Grassel learned exactly what that cost looked like. On screen, the actress who played Caroline Ingalls shared warm and convincing chemistry with Landon, and audiences believed completely in their partnership as husband and wife. Off-screen, the dynamic ran cold. As Little House grew into a massive national success and the money began to reflect that in real terms, Grassel recognized that a significant gap existed between what she was earning and what her male co-star was taking home. and she did something that required genuine courage for an actress working in the mid-1970s. She asked to be paid fairly for the success she was helping to create. The warmth Landon had shown her vanished the moment she made that request. He stopped speaking to her the instant the cameras stopped rolling, and this went on not for a week or a month, but for years. They would film deeply affectionate scenes as Charles and Caroline Ingalls. The camera would cut, and Landon would turn and walk away without a single word passing between them. The audience watching that couple build a life together week after week had no idea the two actors portraying them were living in near total silence the moment each scene ended. Grassel eventually won her fight and earned the respect and pay she deserved, but the price was a daily reality that looked nothing like the warmth of Walnut Grove. The pressure Landon brought to set did not belong exclusively to the adults. Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls, and Melissa Sue Anderson, who played older sister Mary, were on screen the absolute definition of sisterly closeness, sharing beds and secrets, and the kind of bond that audiences pointed to as something real. Off camera, the two young actresses existed in almost entirely separate worlds, and the distance between them was not simply a matter of personality. Gilbert was outgoing and playful and bonded naturally with Landon between takes. Anderson was quieter, more private, and preferred her own space when the cameras were not running. That natural gap between two very different people gradually became something more pronounced over the years, and Gilbert has spoken openly about sensing a genuine coolness from her on-screen sister, while Anderson indicated that the forced family atmosphere of the set sometimes felt more like an obligation than a reality. Neither of them was wrong about what they experienced, and neither of them let it show, which meant the smiles and the hand-holding and the comforting embraces that looked so real on screen were being performed by two young women quietly navigating something far more complicated. The specific pressure placed on Melissa Gilbert took forms more physical than most viewers would ever suspect. As she moved through her teenage years on the show, production became almost obsessive in its determination to preserve her image as Half-Pint, the little girl in the bonnet that audiences had fallen in love with. The wardrobe department put her in restrictive undergarments designed to conceal her developing body, kept her in children's clothing long after it stopped making any physical or narrative sense, and essentially tried to freeze time around a teenager who had no ability to stop growing. At home, she was becoming a young woman. On set, she was being physically contained inside the image of a 10-year-old. And when the time came to film Laura's romantic storyline with Almanzo Wilder, Gilbert has said she was so overwhelmed by the contradiction that she felt genuinely ill, pushed into adult emotional territory by the very same production that refused to acknowledge she was no longer a child. Season 7 brought something to Little House on the Prairie that nobody in the audience expected and that many parents found genuinely disturbing. A two-part story involving a young girl named Sylvia arrived on screens and immediately signaled that the rules of Walnut Grove had shifted. The storyline followed Sylvia as she was stalked by a sinister masked figure, and the tone was not softened or adjusted to fit the family atmosphere that had defined the show for years. Parents who had trusted this program completely, who had built it into their household routine as something safe to watch with their children, found themselves sitting in front of something that felt far closer to a horror story than a pioneer drama. Letters poured into NBC, and the backlash was immediate and loud. What made the Sylvia episodes more unsettling than anything visible on screen was the method Landon used to produce them, because to ensure the fear read as authentic, he had the actor playing the masked figure remain in full costume and move through the edges of the set, even when cameras were trained elsewhere. He wanted the cast to feel watched. He wanted the anxiety in their performances to come from somewhere real. And it worked, because the terror visible on those young actors' faces was not entirely performance. Networks later pulled the Sylvia episodes from many rerun packages, deeming them too intense for the family audience the show had always served, and they remain among the most talked about and least revisited chapters in the entire series. The shadow that fell over the cast and crew of Little House on the Prairie was not only emotional. Big Sky Ranch in Simi Valley, California sat just a few miles from the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, a facility that suffered a serious partial nuclear meltdown in 1959, more than a decade before filming ever began at the ranch. At the time of that accident, the public received minimal information, and the full scope of what may have been released into the surrounding soil and air was not something that entered open conversation for many years afterward. The cast and crew spent years on that land, breathing its dust and working under its sun with no awareness of what the environment around them may have carried. What nobody expected was that looking back later, the pattern of illnesses would become very difficult to set aside. Landon himself was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died at just 54 years old. Victor French, the actor who brought the beloved Mr. Edwards to life with such warmth and physical presence, faced his own devastating health battle in the years following the show. Other cast and crew members reported serious illnesses that collected into something feeling like considerably more than coincidence. No formal scientific link has ever been definitively established, but the question has never gone away either, and it adds a layer of quiet sorrow to those famous opening credit images of children running barefoot through the grass of Simi Valley that is very hard to shake once you know what's sat just a few miles away. The show Landon built was also constructed on a version of history that had been carefully curated and edited long before a single frame was filmed. The source material was Laura Ingalls Wilder's series of beloved books, but before those books existed in their published form, Wilder had written something far more unfiltered, a memoir called Pioneer Girl that described the reality of frontier life in terms considerably more brutal than anything that reached network television. The Ingalls family in that original manuscript faced poverty so severe that at one point they had no house at all, living instead in a dugout carved into the riverbank, essentially a hole in the earth with damp walls and insects, and very little standing between them and the open air. The neighbors they encountered on the frontier were not all warm-hearted eccentrics with life lessons tucked into their pockets. Some were dangerous, some were desperate, and the lawless nature of that landscape produced choices that no amount of creative filtering could have made palatable for a 1970s family audience. None of that made it to screen, because Landon understood that it couldn't and still deliver what he needed the show to be. The most significant thing left out of the television version of the Ingalls family story was not a scene or a hardship, but a person. In real life, Laura Ingalls Wilder had a baby brother named Freddie, the only son born to Charles and Caroline Ingalls, and Freddie died when he was just 9 months old. The grief that loss left behind stayed with the real Laura for the rest of her life, and it was a grief that never made it to Walnut Grove. When Landon built his television family, Freddie simply did not exist. A real child, a real death, and a real wound in the actual Ingalls family history were removed entirely because the emotional weight of an infant's death would have introduced a darkness the show was not built to carry. The filtered version was warmer and more comforting, and that was exactly what Landon was building toward, but it also meant that the world millions of viewers believed in was built on an erasure. And then came the ending, which arrived not quietly, but with dynamite and real fire, and the kind of finality that Michael Landon had always been moving toward. After 9 seasons, with Little House on the Prairie still drawing audiences and the Ingalls family still woven into the weekly fabric of millions of households, Landon decided it was time to stop, and stopping for him never meant simply walking away. The final story arc placed the residents of Walnut Grove in front of a greedy land developer intent on seizing their town, and the choice the townspeople made in response was to destroy it themselves rather than surrender it. Real explosive charges were wired through every building on the set at Big Sky Ranch, and the cast gathered and watched as the church went, then the schoolhouse, then the small wooden homes that had been their world for nearly a decade. The tears that fell were not written into any script. The silence after each explosion was not directed. Landon had built Walnut Grove, and nobody else was going to inherit it, reboot it, continue it, or water it down. 9 seasons, 204 episodes, and the whole thing ended in smoke on a California hillside because its creator refused to let anyone else decide when it was over. What remains today is something that should, by every reasonable measure, have been diminished by everything this story contains. And it has not been diminished at all. Little House on the Prairie still airs in more than 100 countries, still gets translated into new languages, and still moves between generations the way certain objects move through families. Not because someone told you to pass it on, but because you genuinely believe the person receiving it needs to feel what you once felt sitting in front of it. Melissa Gilbert, Allison Arngrim, Karen Grassel, and others who lived through the making of it have spent years holding both the difficulty and the love in the same hands, speaking openly about the tension and the exhaustion and the things that never made it to air, and speaking just as openly about what the show gave them and what it gave the world. They made something extraordinary under conditions that were far from ideal, delivered warmth while navigating coldness, performed closeness while living with distance, and the thing they created together turned out to be true in the only way that ultimately matters, because it touched people, and it keeps touching people, and no amount of dynamite has ever been able to change that.